Hi, everyone. Erich Prince here of Merion West. I'm joined today by Waller Newell. He is a professor of political science, philosophy, and humanities at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. And next year will be a visiting fellow and professor at the University of Florida. And he is the author of Tyranny and Revolution, Rousseau to Heidegger, which will be the subject of our discussion today. We can draw our eyes to the poster in the back of the room, and Waller has Tyranny and Revolution on his wall, so obviously well represented there. And as a lot of our readers probably remember, sort of the impetus for this discussion was a book review by Paul Krauss, one of our writers, on Tyranny and Revolution. And Waller, thank you so much for chatting with me about the book.
It's very nice to be with you. Thank you.
So obviously there's a lot of places to start, but maybe we can start with where this book fits in with your previous work and sort of your career as a whole.
Well, it's the third in a trilogy of books about tyranny. The first was really mainly about ancient versus early modern tyranny. The second one was a kind of history of tyranny from ancient times to the present for a general audience. This one is about European revolutionary thought in particular, beginning with Rousseau and following through with Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. So it's both about the content of their thought, but also how the kind of language that they use, or perhaps the imprudence or extravagance of their rhetoric, contributed to actual revolutionary and totalitarian movements. In the case of Rousseau, the French Revolution. In the case of Marx, naturally Marxism, Leninism. In the case of Nietzsche, arguably fascism. Many people have attributed to him an influence on fascism. And finally, with Martin Heidegger, his commitment to the Third Reich.
And that actually comes at a rather opportune time for Merion West, because in the coming days we'll actually be publishing an essay about Heidegger and Nazism. So this is sort of intersecting well with some of our other content and articles. So one of the ideas that was of pretty significant interest to me, and one of the reasons I said to Paul that we have to have you in to talk about it, was this idea in Rousseau that basically if we could just get rid of this group of people, this faction of society, we'd all be sort of better off. And this is an idea we see playing out again and again throughout history. And as I alluded to when we spoke earlier, among even people I know, if we could just get rid of financiers or people who work in this type of profession, this is the group of people that are sort of holding us back from realizing some sort of utopian idea. And maybe you could just sort of trace the history of that thought. Does it begin with Rousseau? Does it actually precede him in other places? And sort of from a history of ideas perspective, where does that come from?
Sure. I have to begin by setting Hegel to one side for the moment, because I think Hegel was actually a conservative thinker and tried to stem further revolutionary violence like you had in 1789. But with Rousseau, it was this notion that we once lived in a kind of golden age, a state of nature where we were all equal, where we had no need for property, for ambition. Now, Rousseau himself did not believe we could ever recapture that. But some of his self-described students and followers, like Robespierre, interpreted Rousseau as saying that through revolution, we could actually recapture that lost golden age. And so the Jacobins said what they were doing was returning to the year one. All of these great revolutions, starting with the Jacobin terror, Bolshevism, Nazism, and so forth, have a kind of dyadic movement in which it's a kind of either or, a kind of apocalyptic either or, in which one side must absolutely triumph over the other, get them out of the way so that mankind as a whole will enter a period of bliss. I sometimes call it millenarian tyranny because it has a kind of pseudo-religious character to it. It's a kind of secularized version of the end of days and the return of the Messiah. It's also a kind of pseudo-religious movement because these revolutions tell us that we are going to be reborn as completely different people from the way we are now. We will be nothing like the way we are now. It will be like a night and day transformation. And it always does require violence because, as you said, that class or race enemy that stands in the way of future bliss simply has to be gotten rid of.
Can you expand a little bit more on what you alluded to about Hegel being, in your view, a conservative thinker?
Yes, because Hegel was very concerned about the violence that the French Revolution had degenerated into. And he wanted to propound a doctrine of historical progress that would show that it was possible for us to modernize and to become more prosperous, to become more free without revolutionary violence. In other words, he thought that this could be an evolutionary process from within the modern constitutional nation state. And in his writings, he was always at one and the same time keeping a watchful eye on another version of Jacobinism on the left, but he was also worried about a growing kind of romantic blood and soil, tribalistic nationalism on the right. So he's always trying to steer a middle ground between these two extremes. And he hopes that a notion of cumulative, gradual historical progress, not unlike the view of Edmund Burke, by the way, should satisfy people and forestall appeals to revolutionary violence. So that's why I put him to one side.
So obviously there might be a little bit of a difference in how it's presented at the university level versus in secondary schools. But I recall, for instance, when I was in high school myself, it seemed as though sort of in terms of the pedagogy of teaching about the French Revolution, that it was often presented as sort of a good thing. And I'm just wondering, sort of in the popular culture, in universities, in high schools, do you sort of have a sense of the degree to which all the sort of drawbacks and all the bloodshed and such are presented versus, kind of just how the revolution is conceived of by both people in education and in the culture at large?
Sure, it's complicated by the fact that in a way there were two French revolutions. The first revolution was really made by political moderates like Lafayette, Mirabeau, and all they really wanted to achieve for France was something like the Glorious Revolution in England or the American Revolution. They wanted a constitutional monarchy. They wanted parliamentary government. They wanted to encourage property rights and individualism. They weren't looking for more than that. But then when the Jacobins come on the scene, all of that is swept aside as hopelessly too little. And that's where you get this utopian dream of a world in which no one will have property and we'll all live in collective bliss in which the individual is submerged in the collective. And then finally you have Napoleon. In a way, he completes the whole story, but then Napoleon is a person who you can say employed great violence to actually spread the earlier Girondist moderate version of the French Revolution to the rest of Europe. And so I think people are conflicted about how they view that revolution because it had all of these different facets. And even in France, I think there's a certain ambiguity about what one thinks of the revolution and the means that it employed, even through Napoleon, to bring about quite useful and good results for the rest of Europe. But of course, at the cost of millions of lives that were consumed in his wars of conquest.
Now, I know extrapolation and suggesting parallels can be a dangerous exercise, but it seems as though that's a theme we've seen at various points in time where a group of moderate reformers or a group of reformers with a certain specific set of requests that are sort of still borrowing from the original framework get going, and then the movement, so to speak, is captured or taken beyond its original aims by a group of more radical people.
Absolutely. I think you see in the cases of the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, that what begins is often a reluctant despot who nevertheless is willing to liberalize to some extent. It's sometimes forgotten. Louis XVI was probably the most liberalizing of all French monarchs. He really wanted to encourage the growth of a productive economy. But then what happens is that those people are swept aside by the millenarians. The same thing happened in Russia, where Tsar Nicholas was again a half-hearted and fitful reformer who would keep veering back and forth between reform and repression. And so, his last man, Kerensky, is swept aside by Lenin. In Iran, just to take one more example, again, you had the Shah. In some ways, he wanted to modernize and liberalize, but in other ways, he said, I'm still the complete boss. And so the first phase of the Iranian Revolution was a kind of technocratic revolution, but then that was swept aside by the Khomeinists.
And obviously in the book and throughout, even in the preface, you're talking about sort of the different types of sort of radical groups, and you talk about jihadists, and you talk about all these people from the Khmer Rouge on down who have sort of kind of gone too far. Now, obviously, it's sort of at first glance, you say, okay, these are people who are in very different contexts. They're different religions, different languages, different parts of the world. What do they all have in common?
I think what they all have in common is, as I said, this kind of either or apocalyptic scenario in which life is a living hell, or we emerge into a wonderful new world of perfect peace and harmony. And I also think that a common structural element to these revolutions is the need to get rid of the class or group of people who impede the emergence of this new world. For instance, in the case of the Iranian Revolution, what stands in the way of the worldwide caliphate are the two Satans, the little Satan of Israel and the big Satan of America. They somehow have to be disposed of before this wonderful new era can emerge around the entire world.
And I think what can be concerning, and we have obviously the quote on the Merion West About page from Václav Havel, and this idea of kind of people starting down this path, starting down this route, and it doesn't seem as though evidence often kind of shakes their commitments. So, they're going down this path, and they can be doing X, Y, and Z. The blood can be flowing. They're not achieving their desired ends, but often the answer is, let's double down. We need more of this.
That's right.
The problem is insufficient application of what we're doing. We haven't gone far enough. It seems as though in this sort of revolutionary mindset, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, for them to say, well, actually, maybe some of our initial premises are not correct, or actually what we're doing is not working or counterproductive.
There's a story that someone once asked Lenin, how on earth do you think you can make a socialist revolution in Russia where the industrial proletariat is no more than about 2% of the population at most, whereas in Britain, the industrial proletariat is about 80% of the population, and they don't want socialism. And Lenin's reply was, but the British proletariat is merely the empirical proletariat. I'm talking about the revolutionary vanguard. We are going to bring Russia through the bourgeois phase, the capitalist economic phase, but we're going to do it from above in the name of socialism. The productive means of capitalism, but no private property, no surplus value, and all in the service of building a communist state. So yes, I think there is a kind of fantasy at work in many of these utopian visions. Frequently, there's a sense of injury in the background of the leader. For example, Lenin, whose brother was hanged as a terrorist by the Tsar's regime. Hitler, who felt that he had been kept out of art school by people who looked down on him. There's often this wound in the leader that I think explains how they transmute their rage at being somehow offended or overlooked or looked down on into, in a certain sense, revenging themselves on society by becoming the absolute master.
And how do they get so many people to go along with them?
That really is remarkable. I mean, I try to make it clear that in all of these revolutions, there were genuine grievances. People really were suffering in France, in Russia, in Germany. So there were, I think, people who were genuinely idealistic about relieving this suffering. And I think that helps explain why they were able to appeal to so many people. And another reason is that if you look at the biographies of people like Robespierre and Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, they were comparatively young men.
Mm-hmm.
They became top political leaders at an age when, in normal politics, a young man that age would have no prospect of becoming the absolute leader. And I think because they were comparatively young, they appealed to a kind of youthful idealism in their followers. Nazi Germany, for example, Nazism was often simply called the Jugendbewegung, the youth movement. In other words, if you said you belonged to the youth movement, that meant National Socialism. They were completely synonymous with each other.
I think that's a really interesting point. It's actually an article that I'm kind of working on myself, which is sort of, I think in the modern West, we have this view of sort of the young people as kind of inevitably left of center. But as you sort of look around history, Nazi Germany being a great example and plenty of other examples, it seems as though there's a certain maybe pliability in the youth, maybe pliability in people in general, but they could certainly be pushed into a whole number of different sort of ideological causes, and certainly sort of this Anglo-American, the young people are left is certainly not inevitable or historically the case in a lot of other situations.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, look at the young Wordsworth when he recalls his days in Paris when the revolution broke out. He said that I can't quite remember it, but to be there was bliss. To be young was absolutely heaven. Mm-hmm. And so he was fired by a genuine passion for a better life for humankind. And he believed the French Revolution was sincerely trying to bring that about. And then when the terror began, the disillusionment set in. And he, in a way, was traumatized by what the revolution actually turned out to be, as was Schiller in Germany, who began with the same shining expectations of what was happening across the Rhine. But then the horror stories began to float in about what the Jacobins were doing.
I know there's sort of that truism that sort of the one thing we learn from history is that no one learns from history. But as you to before, Waller, it seems in your estimation that there are similar dynamics playing out in a lot of the case studies that you allude to. This idea of let's just get rid of this group of people and we can achieve this sort of utopian idea coupled with this sort of zeal that seems remarkably resistant to evidence to the contrary or kind of encountering various impediments to it. I guess in the throes of things, it's not really possible for the masses to kind of say, hey, we've been here before. Kind of, why are people unable to see that? Why can't they say, hey, we tried this? Obviously, some people can. Twitter's awash with people who say, the Khmer Rouge already did this. There are examples, or,
sure.
Sort of Chairman Mao and the struggle sessions, there are comparisons thrown around, but I guess for some critical mass or plurality of the population, I guess it can be very, very difficult to either see that, or I guess in some cases, once the genie's out of the bottle, so to speak, maybe those who do see it also kind of lack the political participatory power to try to stop it.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's two facets to your observation. One is that the ideological differences among these movements are very important. I'm not saying they're identical, but there are these structural similarities that I think do run across them. Again, this kind of either or, we have to destroy certain people to get to political nirvana. The other thing, though, is that I think that the comparative success of liberal democracy, it's far from flawless, but historically it's been remarkably successful. And I think that very success can anesthetize us to the danger of tyranny because we don't encounter it around us. And it's easy to think, well, that's been outmoded by the progress of history. Now that we've reached the end of history, we don't need people like that anymore, and no one's going to find them appealing. But the way I put it is that, around the margins of the well-lit perimeter of liberal democracy, these wolves are still roaming. And I think that even when developing countries become affluent on a Western scale, there are still going to be people who are not satisfied with mere economic affluence. They're going to want action. They're going to want revolution. And so I'm really just trying to remind people that, to my mind, the ambition to tyrannize is a permanent and recurrent feature on the psychological and political landscape. Fortunately, we live in a regime which, through the division of powers and checks and balances, makes it very difficult for one or two of the three branches to tyrannize over the other. But not all countries are fortunate enough to have that kind of system.
This is a great segue into discussing something you and I were chatting about earlier, which is sort of some contemporary examples of tyranny. But before we do that, I want you to sort of define what you mean by tyranny, and I think distinguish it from, as you were talking about earlier, sort of pre-Enlightenment conceptions of tyranny, or stated differently, tyranny in the context of sort of classical liberalism as its natural alternative.
Yeah, I began getting interested in the theme of tyranny in political theory. The history of political thought is my academic specialty. And in the ancient thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, and Xenophon, there's a general condemnation of tyranny. But they also raise the interesting question, but what if absolute power could be used benevolently? In that case, wouldn't the lawlessness of tyranny be acceptable when ordinarily it isn't? So you can have a kind of besotted monster like Nero or Caligula. They were clearly to be condemned by the ancients. But then you could have someone like Cyrus the Great, Xenophon's hero, who rules without law, but according to the art of government, which he fully understands. Now, we still have both of those types of tyranny with us today, clearly. But then I think with the French Revolution, in my view, you get something distinctively modern, which is a kind of would-be collectivist revolution on behalf of the people, and restoring them to their now lost bliss. And it's with that new kind of revolution that you get the beginning of what I have called utopian genocide, or what was later called industrialized mass murder, because the Jacobins were able to kill approximately 250,000 people across France in the 3 years of the Terror, and those figures only got worse and worse. So I think there's a kind of qualitative change between how the ancients looked at tyranny. Yes, it could be terrible, and despotism can sometimes be an unpleasant experience. But I think with the French Revolution, you get into something which is just on a whole different level. And perhaps the ancients could not have comprehended tyranny in those terms.
And I think that's something that you kind of make clear, is that among a lot of these thinkers, there's this idea of a return to a sort of Greek ideal in many cases, or an ideal from antiquity of what that ideal state looks like. And maybe you could just elaborate a little bit more on that point.
Right. That was one of the main aims of the book, that starting with Rousseau, you get this nostalgia for the lost age of the Greek polis, which then becomes a kind of benchmark for your dissatisfactions with liberalism. In other words, the virtues of Sparta become a kind of foil for the corruption and alienating qualities of bourgeois life in France. And with each of these thinkers, you get a similar vision, except that it's not the same version of the polis in each case. Hegel, being the most moderate of these people, venerates Athenian Periclean Athens, the height of democracy combined with high culture, learning, philosophy. But then with Nietzsche and Heidegger, you get a kind of reveling in archaic, Homeric Greek values of a more distant past, an age of greater violence and heroism. Marx we have to put to one side because Marx simply detested everything about the ancient Greeks. He did not share this nostalgia for the polis in any way, shape, or form. He thought it was just another example of masters ruling slaves. But in all the others, it's a very powerful tonic, this idea that by trying to somehow restore some element of the Greek polis, we will have a foil for exposing what's wrong with modern bourgeois liberalism and liberal democracy.
And can you just, I know you alluded to it briefly, but just when it comes to Heidegger, which I would argue is maybe the most understood of the misunderstood of the thinkers that you present in the book, how he would have conceived of the Greek polis.
Oh, how he would have conceived of the Greek polis. Very much like Nietzsche. In other words, Heidegger vastly preferred the pre-Socratics to Plato and Aristotle. He particularly liked the Heraclitean notion that life or being was flux, that being or nature is polemos, is struggle, is strife. So he wanted to return back behind ancient metaphysics, which he thought had, in a way, tamed our access to being and solidified it into something technocratic. He wanted to reawaken these kind of primordial energies that he thought the pre-Socratics had grasped, and in a way, he wanted to reopen them in the 20th century. He wanted the destiny of the German people to somehow tap into those chaotic, warlike powers, and through attempting to recover the destiny of the German people could throw off the yoke of its two major oppressors, the technological superpowers of America and Russia.
So, kind of moving things to the 2020s, what do you sort of identify as some of the primary locations and characteristics of tyranny, now that we have sort of a better definition and estimation of what you mean when you talk about tyranny? What do you sort of identify as the major centers of tyranny today?
Well, I think you would have to consider China and Russia and Iran as maybe the new axis of tyrannies, with North Korea and other players like Venezuela there in the background. I think that
So you're sort of in broad agreement with the kind of consensus American foreign policy on kind of who the so-called bad actors are in the world.
I'm an unreconstructed neocon, so yeah. I find myself out of sync with what I see as an emerging trend in Republicans, especially younger people, of isolationism. So yes, I do accept that. I think Putin is interesting because he is not interested in restoring the Soviet Union. This is sometimes not understood.
Right.
Putin.
He kind of made that clear in his most recent sort of big speech.
Right.
That was the point that he really, I think, made clear, this idea of, the problem of snitching on your neighbors, and sort of in a lot of his phrasing and such, I think was really all but denouncing the Soviet Union and some of its mores.
Yeah, I would describe his movement as a kind of agrarian populism. It has a lot of the same blood and soil language of Heidegger's praise of National Socialism and Nazi ideology. And one of Putin's chief ideologues, Alexander Dugin, is a very deep student of Heidegger and basically borrowed Heidegger's fascistic language of the 20s and 30s and transferred it to Russia. Putin, for example, agrees with Dugin that Marxism-Leninism was actually a kind of perverted false European importation into Russia, and that it actually undermined what had begun as an agrarian peasant movement for Slavophone nationalism. And so I don't think that's accurate, incidentally, though there's a grain of truth to it. But people sometimes say, well, he wants to restore the Soviet orbit of power. No, he does not. He does not want to do that. He wants to bring in the Slavic peoples back into the motherland. That's his real aim, I think. Now, Xi, on the other hand, to me seems, if we can call Putin kind of fascistic or a populist, Xi seems to me, on the other hand, much more of a top-down Stalinist communist. He's not attempting to restore Chinese traditions, though he sometimes pretends to. What's really interesting about Xi these days is that he has now executed this move to the Maoist left. He began, or at least he was perceived as a follower of his predecessor's attempt to undo Maoism and to allow a degree of market forces, foreign investment, and so forth. And the Chinese economy did fantastically well. Lately, though, Xi seems to be stressing that you rich people have got to get used to the fact that you're not going to have as much wealth as you used to, and that we've got to get back to a spirit of leveling of wealth. And we're now told that as a young man, he devoted hours and hours and hours of time to studying the works of Chairman Mao. So I find that a really interesting shift, and I don't think we know the whole story yet of what's going to happen there.
And you also mentioned Iran.
Iran remains a perennial threat because in jihadist ideology, you want both a worldwide movement to bring about the new caliphate, but you also want a powerful advanced nation state as the house of that revolutionary movement. So far, Iran is the only Muslim country that has achieved that. It has a worldwide revolutionary project, yet housed in a rather formidable nation state with its advanced weaponry and so forth. And so it I think remains a perennial threat to moderate Arab regimes, which it thinks are unfit to rule because they're not true Muslims, and of course to Israel. And now there's this lethal combination of Iran becoming Putin's ally.
So those three nations you alluded to are kind of, obviously, especially China and Russia, powerhouse nations. China with over 1 billion people, Russia about 140 million, Iran, I can't remember off the top of my head, but very sizable population. Kind of where do you see tyranny playing out in maybe smaller countries, also in the developing world, maybe Central America, South America, Africa, kind of where do you see it there, and kind of what characteristics is it exhibiting?
I don't have much of a crystal ball there. I do think another common motif in these revolutionary movements that we've been talking about is that there's a time at which the beginnings of modernization set in, and there's increasing individualism, there's a degree of greater prosperity, but disappointingly slow and meager. And I think at that point that people begin to think, we're not getting the goods we were promised, and our old way of life is being destroyed by alien values. And I can think of a lot of countries in the world that are maybe in that precarious place. Certain African states, for example, where the long promised benefits of joining up with the West, of economic development, have never really quite been delivered. While at the same time, there's a feeling that our traditions are being gradually corroded and worn away. And so I think this just remains a tinderbox for the future, because all of the countries that we've discussed and all of the revolutions going back to the French Revolution, I think, have this syndrome of the lost community and disappointment with the failed promises of modernization.
So sort of to close out the discussion or cap it off a little bit, Waller, where do you see these sort of impulses most playing out kind of in the West? To what degree are they a cause for concern? And where might we be able to the degree they may or may not be coalescing, sort of step in and put up our hands and say, all right, let's settle down, folks?
There certainly is a danger from the alt-right, and it's not accidental that many people in the alt-right in Europe admire Putin. They see him as a great patriotic leader and a model for the kind of leadership that they think France or Italy or Poland needs. And at the same time, they are also followers of, again, Putin's ideologue Alexander Dugin, whose works are widely read in the alt-right in Europe.
In Germany and in the Netherlands, where specifically do you think?
I was just going to say that all said, I myself don't see a really alarming danger for something like Putin-esque fascism to emerge in any of these countries. Now, maybe that puts me at odds with some people. Viktor Orban, for example. Are there worrying things about his rule? Yes. But is he really a potential fascist dictator? I don't think so. I mean, he's done these things with back-to-back parliamentary mandates. And to me, there's no incompatibility with saying that our cultural core is the family and Christianity. I don't think that's in any way incompatible with defending the basic liberties of liberalism. Now, people like Anne Applebaum think that's not the case and that Orban is really dangerous, but I don't think he is. And I think that kind of synthesis of past tradition with liberal individualism, it seems to me, is the only way that we can go forward.
So you think sort of these terms like democratic backsliding that are often thrown around in a lot of academic circles when it comes to Hungary might be overstated?
I think they are overstated. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't some unnerving things about Orban's rule, but he doesn't keep me awake at night to anything like the extent of Putin and the other big people top people that we've talked about here.
And then do you see, because obviously you're sort of there alluding from sort of the right of center perspective, how about when it comes to the left? Do you see in the West any sort of cause for concern in terms of sort of the revolutionary zeal coming from that side of the political spectrum?
Well, I think the old-fashioned revolutionary zeal of Marxism and Marxism-Leninism is largely an entirely spent force in the industrialized Western democracies. And so, as many people have observed, the struggle against liberalism or capitalism has shifted to the realm of culture. Many people credit Gramsci with the original thought that now that there really is no such thing as a proletariat in Europe, we need to be waging these culture wars on behalf of disaffected groups like students and academics, journalists, and so forth. And we're certainly seeing that, I think, working itself out in a rather striking way right now in U.S. politics, U.S. Cultural life. To me, it's kind of a dead heat. I don't see one side prevailing over the other, but it makes for a very fractious and rancorous kind of public debate. And it's only getting more that way. That does concern me, I guess, the rancorous quality of civic dialogue, because we're heading into another presidential season. And so it's I think, only going to get worse. It's not going to get better.
So before we part ways, Waller, can we get a preview of what you'll be focusing on when you head to the University of Florida next year? Kind of what will the focus be among your
okay, thank you. Thanks. I'm thinking of writing a new book that is kind of the sequel to the current one. It's going to be more about techno-tyranny and the conquest of nature. I want to talk about the extent to which old-fashioned brick and mortar tyrannies that still exist and are very powerful, important, to what extent, though, that they might be able to tap into AI and new breakthroughs in technology to actually increase their grip over their subjects. And maybe they don't have to do this now only with fleets and armies and aircraft, but maybe they can do this through actually reconstructing the human psyche through chip technology. There are some very scary scenarios floating around out there. Sometimes these same technologies can do a tremendous lot of good for people. They say that they might be able to control Parkinson's disease, for example, through one of these chips. But then at the same time, doesn't it open up the dangerous possibility that people could be monitored in their very inner psyche? And so this is what I find a kind of disturbing new wrinkle that's been added.
Even sort of before the advent of AI, we're seeing a lot of issues with surveillance and even
that's right.
Kind of people's financial transactions, potentially freezing bank accounts based on certain political activity or speech. And
yes,
people could even argue censorship on social media being a precursor of some of these things. But that is certainly very concerning if we can even sort of the ultimate big brother goal at the end of the book of conquering the inside of people's minds.
Yeah, I don't think we're close to that, but I think it's looming on the horizon. It's going to become a darker alternative, I think, as time goes by. I mean, with technology, there's always an either or, right? Like the same surveillance technology or internet technology that enables tyrants to monitor their subjects can enable dissidents to organize resistance to them. There's always a kind of double-sided coin, but
like
there's
go ahead.
Well, one thing that troubles me is when you think of how people like Xi are putting this surveillance technology to work in his so-called social credit system, which is really just one of the most monstrous scenarios ever designed by a dictatorship. I just hope that we in the democracies don't feel that we need to take on some of these powers ourselves in order to fend them off, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, like Bob Dylan says, I think at night I become my enemy.
Yeah, right.
So
it's a Faustian pact with technology, I think.
Waller, thank you for joining me. Once again, Waller Newell. The book is Tyranny and Revolution, Rousseau to Heidegger. So Waller, thank you so much for this kind of overview of the history of these things, and honestly, a little bit of a chilling precursor, perhaps, of some things to come. So we'll definitely look forward to your new work on that subject and kind of whatever might be emerging from your time at University of Florida. So thanks for joining me.
It was my pleasure, Eric. Thank you for having me.
Take care.